Yeah.
Boy, Rod, you really hit that fast. Boom. Okay, so plan today is, unless things go off the rails, the plan is to do the next mitzvah in our series and to do the next installment on our 13 principles of faith. So basically what we did last week, just the next step. What do y'all say? Sounds like a plan?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let us begin. Make sure everyone's on mute so we could, and we'll stop for questions between the sessions. So everyone, if you have a question, jot it down and we'll get to it. I'll stay as long as there are questions. I pledge to stay here. Okay, let us begin. We are up to mitzvah number 92, which is the prohibition against cooking milk and meat together. And today we'll do mitzvah number 92 and mitzvah number 113, which is a related mitzvah, to not eat nor derive benefit from milk and meat that was cooked together. So we have three different prohibitions. Number one, mitzvah number 92, not to cook the milk and meat together, even if you're not going to consume it. And then mitzvah number 112, and mitzvah number 113 is A, not to eat the cooked milk and meat together, and B, not to derive benefit from the cooked milk and meat together. Now the Talmud tells us that there is a verse that appears 3 times in the Torah, Lo sevashel gedi b'chalev imo, do not cook a kid, a small goat, in its mother's milk. So that's the mixture of milk and meat. And because this verse appears 3 times in the Torah, it's telling us the 3 prohibitions of milk and meat. Number 1, not to cook it together. Number 2, not to consume, even if someone else cooks it. And number 3, not to derive any benefit from a mixture of milk and meat. Now, interestingly, in the delineation of 613 mitzvos, we have 2 mitzvos, even though there are 3 distinct prohibitions, with mitzvah number 92 and mitzvah number 113, which combines the prohibition against consumption and deriving of any benefit. The Sefer Chinuch, the book that we are using to navigate through the 613 mitzvos, spends a lot of time in mitzvah number 113 to explain why we need 3 verses, but we only have 2 and not 3 mitzvos in the counting of the 613. But again, we're going to try to give a little snapshot. So I'm not going to get so much into the inside baseball, into the nuts and bolts and nitty gritty of exactly why it's 2 prohibitions and not 3, even though there are 3 distinct aspects of this idea. We want to give a snapshot, and I'll tell you that with respect to milk and meat and all the laws that flow out of this prohibition, people spend months and months studying. And there are books, really thick books that talk all about all the possible considerations. But again, we try to cover here like in 20 minutes or a half hour, get a snapshot. But it's important to always remember that this is just a picture. This is just a snapshot. This is just a small window into a much bigger subject that we could spend a lot more time discussing at length. So the Sefer Chinuch begins by just explaining the basics. The verse tells us, don't cook a kid, a small goat, in its mother's milk. It seems to be much more narrowly focused than the actual law, which is not just the meat of a small goat, any meat of a cow, of a bovine, of a sheep, any meat in any milk, not just the milk of that particular animal's mother. So the Sefer Chinuch explains that the term gedi, which means a kid, a baby goat, that is a generic term for any meat, and he brings a proof. Elsewhere it says gedi izim, and that specifies goat, and therefore when it says gedi without any attribution, without any specification, that is a reference to any kind of meat. And similarly, just like the meat part of the mixture can be any kind of meat, so too the milk portion of the mixture can be any kind of milk for it to be part of this prohibition. And the reason why it says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, it's just that was simply the most common way to do it. That's the most, the most common liquid that you may have around. but the prohibition extends to any milk or any dairy product. To use that as the base for cooking the meat would be a violation of this mitzvah. Consumption of the product would be a violation of the prohibition against consumption of milk and meat, and you would not be allowed to benefit from that, even if you're not consuming it. To benefit in some other way, that would also be a prohibition. Okay, so that's the basic idea of the law. We have mitzvah number 92, to not cook it, even if you're not benefiting from it directly, you're not consuming it, you're cooking it for someone else, that will be a prohibition. And we have mitzvah number 113, referring to eating and benefiting. There is a prohibition against consumption and benefiting from milk and meat together. So let's go through some of the laws before we try to understand what the principal idea here is. So again, as we mentioned, there is a prohibition between cooking. There's a prohibition against cooking even if someone does not consume. So to be a line cook in a non-kosher establishment that has milk and meat, provided that indeed qualifies as halachic milk and meat, that would be a prohibition. Now, there is a difference between this prohibition against consumption of forbidden food and all other forbidden foods. Let me explain. Normally, the things that are prohibited to eat, there's a certain format of consumption. That you eat it and you enjoy it and you consume it the normal, ordinary way that food is consumed. If you're going to consume something in an unusual fashion, that might be a workaround against some of the prohibited foods that we cannot consume. Whereas by milk and meat, even if there is no benefit, there's no enjoyment. So for example, the food's piping hot and you consume it and you don't chew it, you don't taste it, you don't enjoy it, it burns your throat. Nevertheless, that would be a prohibition of this mitzvah against consumption of milk and meat, even though ordinarily that would not qualify as a form of consumption that would indeed have the full weight of the prohibition. Now, interestingly, from a biblical perspective, the problem with milk and meat is only when the milk is kosher and the meat's kosher independently. It's the mixture that's the problem. And this is one of the mitzvahs that we'll see that is a prohibited mixture of two independently okay things. The milk is kosher. It comes from a kosher animal. The meat is kosher. The meat comes from a kosher animal. It's just that the union of the two is the problem. So for example, what if you have meat from a non-kosher animal or milk from a non-kosher animal? That would not qualify, at least on a biblical sense, because the rabbinic laws, there's lots of rabbinic edicts and decrees on top of the original biblical law. But from a biblical perspective, just the baseline of the law, if you have a non-kosher animal or non-kosher meat, if you have non-kosher meat or non-kosher milk, then that would not qualify as the prohibition of milk and meat. Now, in addition, from a biblical perspective, this is referring only to domesticated animals. So a deer, venison's kosher. It's got the split hooves, it chews its cud, it qualifies as a kosher animal. But because it is what's called a chaya, not a behema, not basar, just these are the Hebrew terms for domesticated versus undomesticated animals, because it is a non-domesticated animal, it would not qualify as part of the biblical prohibition against milk and meat. And similarly, fowl and poultry, these are not considered animals. This is poultry, a different classification. They would not qualify biblically as part of the meat that would be part of this general category of milk and meat. Now, from a rabbinic perspective, the rabbis made a lot of decrees on top of the original law, and that's why poultry and milk is a big no-no, and venison and milk is also a big no-no, but there are differences. primarily, chiefly, that you can cook and benefit from it, even though you cannot consume it. So we have certain areas of the law are extended to those parts or to those animals that are not part of the biblical law, but not everything is extended. And the Sefer Chinuch, and this is a theme that appears throughout all the literature, he stresses that it's really hard to differentiate between poultry and, let's say, turkey. If you have a beef burger and a turkey burger and a chicken burger, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. And therefore, if you were to mix milk and meat, put a piece of cheese on your turkey burger, to the innocent bystander, to the onlooker, it seems like you're mixing milk and meat, and therefore something which appears to be a violation of the Torah law, the rabbis very frequently would come and say, let's extend the biblical law with a rabbinic edict in order to prevent copycatters, in order to prevent people to misinterpret what's happening. And they may come to say, well, look, the rabbi's eating the milk and the meat together. It is okay. No, even turkey burgers, even chicken burgers, even poultry, fowl of all types is extended that you cannot consume that together with milk. Now, what difference is there? This is just an example of how far-reaching these laws are. What difference is there that you can benefit from certain things, even though you cannot consume them? So a very common question people have is pet food. If it's biblically prohibited to benefit from a certain concoction of milk and meat, you cannot benefit by giving it to your pet. That would be benefiting. Even if you're not consuming it yourself, you're not cooking it yourself, but you are benefiting from it. And therefore, if it is part of the category of things that you cannot consume, but you can indeed benefit from, that would be an example of something that you can give to your pets. Okay, so let's go through some of the other laws here. Because there is such an emphasis on the separation of the dairy, the milk, and the meat, the sages enacted the following decree. And this is both for meat, which is biblically prohibited to be mixed with milk, and for fowl, which is only rabbinically prohibited. There is a restriction against consumption of dairy products and of meat products on the same table. So suppose one kid's having a hot dog and the other kid's having a piece of pizza. You got to put them on separate tables. Or at a minimum, one of them is on a tablecloth and you pull up the tablecloth and the other one's, let's see, on the table itself. There's a distinction in the table between the part of the table that there's the consumption of the milk and the part of the table that there is the consumption of the meat. And again, this is a very unique situation in that this is a decree on top of a decree. Why? Because fowl, poultry, and milk, well, that's a rabbinic decree. And here we have a double decree. There is, not only is there a concern of the poultry and the milk, but there's an additional decree to put them on separate tables, or at least on separate tablecloths, in order to prevent any sort of encroachment from one upon the other. In addition, and again, we're running through some of the laws here just to give the picture, the overall picture of what is included in this mitzvah. In addition, the sages enacted a waiting period, a cooling off period. Now, the exact length of this period is a subject of different customs. It's anywhere from 1 hour to 6 hours after the consumption of meat and poultry before the consumption of any dairy. So if you have a barbecue and you are observant of these laws, you would wait 6 hours or 5 hours or 3 hours or 5.5 hours or 1 hour, different customs, before you have your ice cream. And the idea is that the meat potentially leaves residue in your mouth. Maybe there's some pieces of meat stuck between your teeth, and it takes a while for that to be cleansed out. And therefore, the rabbis instituted a waiting period after the consumption of meat before the consumption of dairy. Now, it doesn't work the other way around. So if you have dairy, immediately you can have meat, but if you have meat, you cannot immediately have dairy. And again, this is part of the rabbinic extensions of this law. From the biblical perspective, it's only when they're cooked together. Come along the rabbis and they say, well, there's a concern of some sort of residual leftovers of your hot dog, your steak in your teeth or in your mouth, and therefore it's a problem to consume milk or milk products afterwards. But vice versa, if you have your ice cream, if you have your pizza, you can go right afterwards to consume your meat, provided that, the custom is to have, let's say, a drink of water or even wait 5 minutes or something like that, but something negligible to make sure that there's actually nothing left over from the ice cream or dairy products. This, by the way, gives term to a phenomenon called fleischigitis. Have you ever heard of this term? So the Yiddish term for meat is Fleisch or Fleisch. And fleischig is when someone is under the restrictions because they have consumed meat. So for 6 hours after the consumption of meat, the way it was always described back in Europe, that person is quote unquote fleischig, meaning they're under the restrictions of someone who has recently consumed meat. So if you're worried that there's going to be like an appearance of an ice cream truck or someone's going to show up with chocolate, you don't want to be fleischig. You don't want to be under the restrictions of being someone who recently consumed meat, and therefore there's a fleischigitis, where you see something, it looks really nice, a stew, it's something you want to nibble on leftovers or something like that, but you have fleischigitis, you're terrified, what's going to be when I want the chocolate, when I want the M&Ms, when I want the ice cream? That's a problem. I don't want to take any chances. I don't want to put myself under the 6-hour moratorium. Again, this is there's a lot of ancillary discussion around this, but that is another component of this law. Another idea here, I know this is a very big subject, but we're going to cover it in a minute. There's the concept of 1/60th negligibility, meaning suppose you have your beef stew, and for whatever reason, you're drinking your coffee and a drop of the milk or the milk that was in the coffee drips into your beef stew. What now? You have cooked milk and meat together. So there is a general principle called 1/60th negligibility, that if there is a component of a mixture that is smaller than a 60th, so 1 unit out of 60, then that becomes negligible in most cases. For example, with chametz, there's no negligibility. So the tiniest drop of chametz is going to disqualify an entire vat of something which is kosher for Pesach. But with respect to milk and meat, if you have a drop of meat falling into, let's say, a dairy pot, or vice versa, with more than or fewer than a 60th of the encroaching either dairy or milk, it becomes negligible, and the pot and all its contents can still be consumed. But again, there's a whole cascading list of laws of all the different scenarios and all the different permutations of this, but that's another general principle in this particular law. Now listen to this. What about almond milk? The commentaries talk about almond milk, because almond milk, it looks like milk. It's easily confusable with milk, but it is not milk. It's not dairy. So there's an interesting law that tells us that you can, in fact, cook meat in almond milk. However, because there's the concern of someone else seeing it and misinterpreting what's happening over here, you have to make sure that there are olives around. You have to make sure that there are almonds around, either in the mixture or next to the mixture, in a way that makes it evident this is almond milk and not regular ordinary milk. Another general aspect of this particular mitzvah is the idea of what happens to a pot when milk or meat was cooked in it. So there is a principle that states that when you cook something, heat, it changes the status of the vessel in which something was cooked. Meaning, because there is food in a given pot, the heat is going to transfer some of that food into the walls of the pot, and that can be expelled, that can be excreted, so to speak, the next time that there is heat introduced to that environment. Meaning, if you have a brand new pot, it has no status. The second you put the meat stew in it, now that pot becomes a meaty pot. And therefore, if you were to cook dairy in that same pot, part of the residue, the leftover taste and experience of the meat that was cooked there previously is going to be expelled into the dairy, and that's a problem. And therefore, you have to separate your pots. You're going to have the milk and the dairy pots, and you'll have the meat and the meaty pots, and they should never be used for the other kind. Now, incidentally, glass, the Talmud tells us, is non-porous. And therefore, glass is the one material that can be used interchangeably. It can be used for milk and meat because nothing is absorbed in the walls of a glass vessel. Now, stainless steel, we know scientifically that stainless steel is non-porous. And someone once told me, and I'm somewhat dubious of this, someone once told me that when Messiah comes, the first thing the Messiah is going to say is that stainless steel is non-porous, and therefore you could use it for both milk and meat. And of course, in the Talmud's times, there was no stainless steel, and therefore we cannot carve out an exception ourselves. But Messiah is going to come, and that's the first thing they're going to declare. Get off the boat, get off the plane, get off the donkey, and say, well, I have a big announcement. Stainless steel is non-porous. You can use it interchangeably for milk and meat. I'm dubious. I think there may be some other things the Messiah will want to declare. First, we'll have to wait and see. Now, in a practical term, a kosher kitchen.
Right here?
Yeah.
Is that one right there? Can we mute? We're good? In practical terms, a kosher kitchen is going to be divided into two. Very often you'll have two sinks, one for milk and milk products and milk dishes and milk cutlery and milk pots and pans, and one for the meat variety. You'll have two sets of cutlery. You'll have two dishwashers, or one, but you wouldn't use them for both. You'll have an oven, like let's say a toaster oven for dairy, and a regular ordinary oven for meat. And the knives and the pots and the cooking utensils are going to be color-coded and placed in different drawers. When we lived in Israel, we only had one sink. The apartment that we rented had only one sink. So we had different inserts. So we treated that sink as if it was non-kosher because it's a receptacle for both milk and meat, but you would put an insert in the bottom of the sink, and you'd have two of them, one for milk and one for meat. Okay, so there are many other interesting laws that we could talk about briefly. The milk of a dead animal. What do you do if you slaughter the animal? The animal has, let's say, milk in its stomach, the milk that's found in the udder. So the udder of a cow, well, it's kosher meat, but it's drenched in milk. Talmud says that might be an exception. That might be the only kosher way you can have milk and meat is if you consume from the udder, the milk of the udder of a cow. And in fact, there's a very interesting Talmudic piece that says that there's a kosher outlet for every bad habit. You want milk and meat? There's a kosher variety of it. Eat from the udder. You want to taste pork? Well, apparently there is a fish called the shibuta fish. And the head of the shibuta fish tastes indistinguishable from pork. And therefore, if you want it, go knock yourself out. There is a kosher version of every bad habit. Now, over the years, I've gotten a lot of complaints about milk and meat. Rabbi, milk and meat, Why is it so? There's so many rabbinic restrictions. The Torah says don't cook a kid in its mother's milk, and somehow we have to have like two separate lives, two separate identities, two separate kitchens, two separate universes. And of course, I'm exaggerating, but people are bothered by all the rabbinic extensions to the core Torah law. And I think there's a way to think about this that makes the entire subject more understandable. Suppose you viewed a violation of Torah as like an accident in a nuclear facility, or better yet, a BSL-4, a biosafety level 4 place where they study viruses. Suppose you viewed a violation of the Torah with such severity. What kind of ordinances, what kind of safety measures are being placed to prevent these kinds of accidents? Obviously, you try going to visit a nuclear facility, see how different layers of security there are before you get to the reactor, before you get to the centrifuge. Why? Because an accident here is very disastrous. It's devastating. It has all kinds of global consequences. I think the reason why the sages here and elsewhere, the reason why they added so many extensions to the core prohibition is because they viewed a violation of Torah with grave severity. And as a result, they added any kind of potential concern that could potentially yield to an encroachment upon the sacrosanct law. They're going to make a restriction. And the reason why it's hard for us to understand that, we're really going to get mixed up between a turkey burger and a meat burger. How often will that happen? How often will that happen? Even if it happens once every million instances, for the sages who viewed the Torah with such importance and such harsh severity, or at least viewed the violation of the will of God with such seriousness, they're not willing to take even that chance. I think it's a nice framework to understand the rabbis and their modus operandi of how they dealt with potential encroachments upon Torah law. So let's get to the other aspect of this mitzvah that I want to ponder, and that is the reason for this mitzvah. And again, we always say the ultimate reason for any mitzvah is because that is the will of God. Nevertheless, we try to understand a little bit about how we can make sense, how we can process logically a given mitzvah. So the Sefer Chinuch, again, the book that we are using to navigate through the mitzvos, he says, and he kind of even explicitly mentions that there seems to be some Kabbalistic undertones to this idea. And to fully understand it, you really need to go to the Kabbalistic literature. But he says that this is an example of an unnatural combination. It doesn't really elaborate what that means, but the milk and the meat cannot be connected because there's something problematic about this union. It doesn't explain really what that is, but that would explain why, even if you're not going to consume it, just the mixture itself, just the cooking of this itself is problematic. And he quotes the Rambam. He's not a fan of this idea. He says, the Rambam says that this was an idolatrous practice. The idol worshippers would always mix the milk and meat, and therefore, as a way to kind of distance us from anything even tangentially related to the idol worshippers, the Torah prohibited the mixture of milk and meat. The Ramban, he says something that makes a little bit more sense to us. He says that all milk, it comes from animals. And all meat, it also comes from animals. And therefore, there's an element of cruelty for us to use the liquid that comes from animals to kill and to cook the animal itself. And therefore, as a way to distancing us from cruelty, the Torah says don't use the byproduct of an animal to process and to cook that said animal. A nice idea that makes a little bit more sense to us. And then there's Rabbeinu Bechaya. He says, listen to this. He says that milk comes from blood. It's processed through the animal and it turns into milk. But consumption of blood is likely to lead that person, the person who consumes it, into cruelty. And the milk reverts back to blood when it's mixed with meat. And therefore, if you're going to consume milk and meat, the milk part of that concoction is going to be or have the quality of blood in that it's going to make you more cruel. And therefore, that's his reason why we should avoid it. But ultimately, as we mentioned earlier, the real reason is because that's what God decreed upon us. I had a friend who told me that there are enzymes. I don't remember the details of what he said. Something to the effect of there are enzymes that are needed to digest meat. And when you add milk to that, the milk is not properly digested. And therefore, it's unhealthy for you to have meat and then milk, but vice versa, it's not a problem. So I don't know if that's true or not, but regardless, even if it was true, it's probably a result of the law, not the cause of the law. Meaning the Torah precedes the world, and therefore if you find that a given Torah law is actually better for your health, it's most likely the result of the Torah, not the cause of the Torah, because again, the Torah preceded the world. So that's the mitzvah in a nutshell. Mixing milk and meat, we don't do it, we don't cook it, we don't consume it, and we don't derive any benefit from it. As always, my address is rabbi@wolbe.com. We'll pause for any questions before we begin our next subject.
I have a question, Rabbi.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, you're saying that we can't derive benefit, but what if it's a necessity for like a panasa purpose? Like if I'm a chef and I'm cooking non-kosher meat in a non-kosher kitchen for non-Jew or Jew people that aren't Jewish, is it still prohibited for me to do that?
Okay, so there are carve-outs for any life-threatening situation. There's a carve-out for almost every law.
Okay,
making a living would not be a carve-out. Now, the question is, this is how I would frame your question. The question is it a violation of this law when the meat's not kosher?
Right. But
so if the meat's not kosher and the milk's not kosher, the mixture is not a problem.
Okay.
So that might be the workaround. Again, but that's a more advanced question. But the workaround might be that given the meat itself is not kosher. Again, what we mentioned earlier, the problem is only when there's a mixture. There's a mixture, and the mixture is the problem. But if the meat itself wasn't kosher, then it's not the mixture or the addition of the milk that's causing the thing to be not kosher. It was kosher. It was non-kosher to begin with.
Okay, and then
so that might be the workaround, but the workaround would not be because of a need to make a living. That would not be a legitimate workaround for this particular mitzvah.
Okay, so, and I know you said like it depends, essentially where it depends on where people are holding, if it's 6 hours or 4 hours.
Yes.
So I know some people that were skipping like 2 hours between chicken. Is that a thing or because
different customs? They're different customs.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. Go ahead, Paul.
So I didn't follow the final conclusion about the pet food. So if your pet food is a mixture of milk and meat, and is it yes, you can give it to the pet, or no, you can't because you would be benefiting from that?
The question is what kind of milk and what kind of meat. So if it's, let's say, if it's pork, not a problem. Not a problem. If it's any non-kosher animal, not a problem. If it's milk and meat, it might be a violation of this. I don't have any pets, But I know that some of my friends who have pets, they've had to deal with, there's this brand and that brand and that brand, and some are a problem, some are not a problem.
Mm.
So you would have to research that question directly. Okay, who's next? Not all at once. Slow down.
Rabbi, I've got a question.
Yes, hi.
So none of these actually relate to a Noahide?
That's right. That's right. This mitzvah will not relate to Noahide. And again, like we mentioned in the past, this it's important for Noahides to know a basic idea of the Torah, and that's why it would be relevant on that level, but not on a practical level. It's not one of the 7 Noahide laws. Is that it, Lee?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay. So should we begin the next subject? Anyone else wants to chime in over here?
I have one quick question, please.
Yes, go ahead.
I understand all the precepts and the laws, and I don't mean this to sound sarcastic, but is this why I'm meeting so many vegetarian Jews? Is it just easier to keep one whole product out of your home?
I don't think so. I don't think so, because for someone who grew up in this, like, it's not a big deal at all. Like, this is the initiation into this kind of way of living, and to know how to navigate the supermarket as a kosher consumer, that is something you learn. Once you learn it, it's very simple. It becomes second nature. I don't think that this will be a good reason to become a vegetarian, because it is relatively easy once you're used to it. It takes time getting used to changing your eating habits and your grocery shopping habits. That takes some learning, but once you know that, it's kind of relatively simple. So I don't think that's why you see so many Jewish vegetarians. People have vegetarians for various reasons. Some people it's better for their health, and some people they just don't like meat. Everyone has their own thing. I always say that there's no problem being a vegetarian. There's only one problem being a vegetarian, and that is that when Messiah comes and the temple is rebuilt, every Jew must consume an olive's volume of meat once a year, and that is the Pesach, the Paschal offering. You have to eat a minimum of an olive's volume of meat once a year. So that's all you need to do. That's the only mitzvah of consumption of meat. So that's it. Once a year, an olive's volume, the size of a shot glass, really, really small. That's it. I don't even think you have to chew. Take it like a pill if you don't like meat at all.
Rabbi, I've got another question quickly while we're on the subject.
Sure.
Obviously, we ask God to bless our food, and we bless God for providing our food. My question is, because we get a lot of takeaways, or a lot of people get takeaways and things like that, and the food comes from non-kosher places, or let's call it Hindus or all the other religions, are we still allowed to ask God to bless the hands who prepared the food for us?
Can I rephrase your question? Tell me if this is your question. You want to know if you make a blessing on non-kosher food?
Not a blessing, just thanking God that He's provided a meal for us.
Again, so for someone who's not bound by the laws of kosher, like a Noahide, then I would say definitely yes. For someone who is bound by the laws of kosher, that would be a problem. That would be a problem unless it would be a case where someone is allowed to eat it. They talk about the the diabetics who, if they don't get food right away, they're going to die. And there's, or it's a life-threatening situation, they're required to eat non-kosher, because if that's all that's available, that's what they have to eat. Talmud talks about someone who, the doctors insist that the only kind of food that could heal them is a non-kosher animal. Again, in that case, it's a mitzvah to eat it. So in that case, you would make a blessing. But if it is non-kosher, there's two establishments. There's the kosher Chinese restaurant and there's a non-kosher Chinese restaurant, and the Jew selects the non-kosher. How can they make a blessing to God in that? It's kind of like a slap in the face.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Yes.
So
it's a lovely background. I'm enjoying.
Thank you. Channel Islands out of Ventura County in California. So I had a question. And this might be I might be thinking way too deep on this, overanalyzing. But my question was, in terms of the blood.
Yes.
As you're saying about the milk and it being the bloodstream. So this is where I'm going to go way left with this. All right. No political joke there. But the blood I was reading of Genesis 4:10, where it says, and the Lord said, what have you done? And this is in regards to I believe it's
Cain and Abel.
Yeah, the voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And I think I've heard of this before, and this is probably way too extreme, right? I'm over analyzing it, right? But does the blood then from the milk become prohibition? Because in that sense, could it be in that sense as well, with the mixture of something that's still living into something that's the meat of the animal? The mixture could be inadvertently not be. It could not be good in that sense, if that makes sense.
Well, again, he doesn't explain to us that source that we said that the meat kind of reanimates the blood. He doesn't explain the mechanism behind it.
Okay.
But on a basic level, there is a prohibition, and we'll get to it, against consumption of blood. There's lots of laws that we have not yet quite gotten to of prohibited foods. One of them is blood. And the Torah tells us, because the soul is in the blood, Adamu HaNefesh. And the Ramban there explains is that, when you consume the meat of an animal, it's a very different absorption than the blood of the animal. The blood is much more, you're absorbing the very coarse and base and animalistic parts of the animal. It makes you more animalistic yourself. And that's the idea. The idea is we don't want to have the blood. And the Rabbeinu Bachai explains that this is the milk really comes from the blood, and by mixing it with meat, it makes it more, it qualifies it once again as blood.
Right.
That's the idea. But I wouldn't extend it that much further. And again, he doesn't explain the mechanism.
Okay. So that then therefore by default would not fall into the prohibition of animal cruelty.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Paul, you have your hand up again, or that's the leftover from the first time?
No, still have another question.
Yes, go ahead.
You answered the question a little bit in that you said there is no requirement to eat meat for a Jewish person right now, and that'll be but I was just, my presumption was there was a requirement, say for like Passover, but I don't.
Yeah, Passover, provided that there's
from
temple, we have the Paschal sacrifice. That's what I said, the 1 olives volume a year. That's the Paschal sacrifice. But not now. That's right, not now. I do know vegetarians, and again, there's another subject of vegetarians that people who, we might have talked about this in the past, but people who become vegetarians for animal cruelty reasons, that's a separate discussion. We don't believe in that. We believe the animals were given here for us to enjoy. We believe in a hierarchy, that the humans are higher and the animals are there to service us. So we have no moral problem with consumption of meat. If someone has health problems or they don't like it, whatever, not a problem. But I do know people who were vegetarians for health reasons, But on Pesach, like the Seder, they would eat poultry. They would eat meat. Maybe it was kind of symbolic of the fact that there's one time a year that we're supposed to eat meat regardless, obviously in an idealized sense. But again, to your point, no, there's no requirement to eat meat today. Okay, shall we begin our next subject?
Well, Rabbi, we've got one.
Yes, sure. I tell you, I'll stay as long as you want.
Rod and I were just messaging in private chat, so he's involved in this. So,
Okay.
in regards to the milk reverting back to blood, if that happens, and we said this did not apply, even mixing dairy and meat did not apply to Noahides. But if that does happen, if the milk does revert back to blood, then would that fall under the 7 Noahide laws of not eating the limb of a living animal? And then would it apply?
No, so it's important to understand the context of this idea. It's a good question, and it's important to understand the context. The context is he's giving a very Kabbalistic, a very esoteric explanation for the reason of the mitzvah. That doesn't have the same equal footing as the law itself. And if the law itself does not apply to non-Jews. Now, if someone's a non-Jew and says, well, there is a great rabbi who says this to make me more cruel and therefore I'm not going to do it, all the power to them. But we cannot equate it with an actual law. We have to understand the context. The context is, this is an interpretation of one of the great sages, don't get me wrong, of course, one of the great sages, but this is an interpretation of the reason behind the mitzvah. But he's not saying that this mitzvah, by extension, we could say is incorporated into the general rubric of the 7 Noahide laws.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay, so we're going to start the next subject. And again, I want to stress what I said last week. We're starting to get a little bit later than I thought we would. So I want to make sure everyone knows that if you have to leave early, please don't hesitate. Don't feel bad. I'm so honored that y'all want to spend time with me. And so please, don't feel bad. You have to leave. You can catch it on the podcast or whatever. You can email me and I'll send you the recording. No worries. So again, you don't have to apologize. Just I'm so thankful that you're here as long as you're here. But again, if you have to leave, just please don't hesitate. Okay, let us begin. Okay. We spoke about last time about the general concept of reward and punishment. We proved that the Almighty indeed dispenses reward and punishment. If someone does a mitzvah, if someone adheres to the will of God, they will be the recipients of reward. If someone transgresses the will of God, they will be recipients of divine punishment. Of course, we talked about the ideal. On an idealized world, we should be motivated for altruistic reasons to do mitzvos. We should try the mitzvahs not necessarily because of the reward, and we should avoid transgressions not to avoid punishment. But of course, that's a very high level. And beginners should, we're told, in fact, be motivated by reward and punishment. And we spoke briefly about the concept of the afterlife, how it is the venue of reward and punishment in most cases. Today, I want to get down to the specifics and to broaden our discussion about the systems and the nature and the unique characteristics of divine reward and punishment. The concept of reward and punishment exists in our world. Humans, we reward good behavior and we punish bad behavior. But I want to focus now specifically on what we know about how the Almighty dispenses reward and punishment, because we will discover that it is in fact different than the way we do it here. So let's begin. The first idea is based upon a verse in Devarim, chapter 32. This is Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 4. This is part of the Song of Ha'azinu. And it tells us that God is fair and just and precise in judgment. The way he doles out reward and punishment is with precision and with justice. Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo, the rock, his deeds are perfect. Tichol Rachav Mishpat, all his ways are just. Elu Menovein Avel, He's a faithful God, a trustworthy God, and there's no iniquity, there's no corruption. Tzaddik v'yashar hu. He is true, he is righteous, he is upstanding. What does this mean? So Rashi tells us a bunch of interesting aspects of divine reward and punishment. So first of all, he tells us, Hatzur Tamim Pa'alo. God is like a rock. It's a name of God. But his deeds are perfect. What that means is, even though the Almighty is omnipotent, even though the Almighty is all-powerful, nevertheless, when he metes out punishment upon the wicked, he doesn't come at them with a flood. He doesn't pummel them in punishment. Rather, he does what's proper. His deeds are perfect. Okay, that's the first idea. And then he says the second idea. And this idea is going to upend our basic understanding of how reward and punishment is in fact dispensed. And there's a few moving parts here, so you have to listen carefully. El Emunah, a trustworthy God. What does that mean? Says Rashi. God is trustworthy. Lishalim litzadikim, to pay the tzadikim, the righteous, tzidkasam, their merits, their righteousness, le'olam haba, in olam haba, in the afterlife. So God is trustworthy to reward the righteous for their righteousness in olam haba. And even though he's going to delay his payment, you do a mitzvah here, and then you live till 150, you have to wait 150 years at a minimum. We don't know exactly the timeline of Olam Haba. We'll talk more about that at great length down the line. But your whole life, you don't get any reward. So the money is not paying you on time. Nevertheless, you could trust God, he'll pay you for your righteousness, for the righteous people in Olam Haba. In the end, the Almighty will deliver. Ve'ein aval, there is no iniquity. What does it mean that God's treatment of us is fair? There's no iniquity. Af l'rishayim, the Almighty will also reward the wicked. He will pay their reward for their righteousness, whatever righteousness a wicked person has, be'olam hazeh, in this world. So the Almighty is trustworthy. He'll pay the righteous for the righteousness in the world to come, and he will also pay the wicked, people who are generally wicked, but also have a few mitzvos, he will pay their righteousness in this world. Concludes the verse, Tzaddik v'yasharhu, God is righteous and upstanding. Everyone justifies the judgment of God. So Rashi tells us something very interesting. God is just. God is fair. God is righteous in dispensing reward and punishment. So that's the general idea of the verse. And that the righteous, they're going to have their reward delayed until the afterlife. And the wicked, they're going to get their reward for their comparatively few mitzvos in this world. And everyone accepts his judgment as righteous. Now, this Rashi is actually a citation from the Talmud in the book of Tanis, page 11a. And this is a very interesting and instructive piece on how God dispenses reward and punishment. And is going to unlock for us many of the unique aspects of divine reward and punishment. It gives us a little bit more context. It tells us God is a trustworthy God, just as the Almighty will punish the wicked in Olam Haba, even for a small transgression. So too, the Almighty will punish the righteous in this world, even for a small transgression. And just as the Almighty will reward the righteous in Olam Haba, even for a small mitzvah, so too, the Almighty will reward the wicked in this world, even for a small mitzvah. So if we unpack this Talmud, we discover some very important ideas. So first of all, first important idea, a person's general righteousness does not overshadow all the preponderance of deeds that they do. Meaning, a righteous person, someone's righteous person in general, they don't have blanket immunity for the few sins that they actually did. So a righteous person, they did a few sins, those sins must be punished for, provided the person doesn't repent. Conversely, if you have a wicked person, God does not ignore the few measly, meager, paltry mitzvos that the wicked person does. Every mitzvah, no matter how big or small, and no matter the relative righteousness of the person who does it, that mitzvah engenders reward. Similarly with transgressions. No mitzvah is too small to be negligible. No sin is too small to be ignored. So that's idea number one. Righteousness of the individual does not overshadow all their deeds, and there are different sizes of mitzvahs relative to how much reward they get, similarly with sin, and all that's accounted for. But the big bombshell of this Talmud is that the venue of reward and punishment is different for the righteous and the wicked. The righteous are punished here for their few sins and rewarded in Olam Haba, in the future, down the line, for their many mitzvos. And the wicked get the opposite treatment. They are rewarded here for their few mitzvos, and they are punished in Olam Haba for their many sins. So when we say that there's no ultimate reward for mitzvahs in this world, we have to be much more nuanced about it. Excuse me. That is referring only to the righteous who have their reward saved for Olam Haba. For the wicked, they in fact get their reward here. So let's explain what this is actually telling us. Ultimate reward and ultimate punishment is indeed reserved for Olam Haba. But depending upon the righteousness of the individual, that will determine if they are recipient of ultimate reward or of ultimate punishment. Every person, they have their ultimate state, and then they have the incidental things that they do out of character. A righteous person, their ultimate state is one of reward, because ultimately, kind of in aggregate, they're a righteous person. They have some incidental sins, and all incidentals are dealt with here. For the righteous, the incidentals, well, that's the sins, and that is dealt over here. For the wicked, their ultimate standing is one of being wicked, and what's incidental are those mitzvos, and again, incidentals are dealt with here. So we could still say that ultimate reward and punishment is dispensed in Olam Haba, but a person who is righteous in general, their ultimate destiny is that of reward, and therefore they get the reward in Olam Haba. A person who is generally wicked, their ultimate destiny is punishment, because they're ultimately a wicked person, and therefore that too is reserved for Olam Haba. Olam Haba is the place, the world to come, the afterlife, is a place where a person's ultimate standing is determined. And here, in this world, that is where we address the incidentals. The mitzvos of the wicked, those incidental few mitzvahs that they did, addressed here. The few sins of the righteous, those incidentals, are addressed here. Incidentals are dealt with in this world. The ultimate venue of reward and punishment is, in fact, the afterlife. Now, this brings us to another critical point, which I like to call the Almighty's pro-choice stance. I'm trying to get everyone's attention here. Listen to this. We know that reward in Olam Haba greatly exceeds reward in this world. How do we know that? Because it says so explicitly. The Mishnah tells us in the 4th chapter of Pirkei Avos, Yafeh sha'a achas shel kol ras ruach b'olam haba. It's better to have 1 hour of pleasure in the afterlife, that is greater mikol chayei olam hazeh, than all the life of this world. Reward in the afterlife dwarfs reward in this world. And therefore, we have a problem. Because the verse is touting the Almighty's fairness. He is a trustworthy God. He is a fair God. There's no iniquity. He's righteous. He's upstanding. Yet when the Talmud explains the system here, it's describing a very unfair, a very inequitable system. Why? You have a righteous person, does a mitzvah. You have a wicked person, does the identical mitzvah. Because for the righteous person, that's part of their ultimate destiny. That is reward in Olam Haba. And because this is part of the incidental behavior of the wicked person, it's rewarded here. So you have a system where two identical mitzvahs are done, and one of them receives a reward in the ultimate venue of reward, and that's much greater than the wicked person who receives reward in this world on a much lower level. And yet the Talmud says that this is the interpretation of the verse that says God is fair. And the answer is that God is pro-choice. The Almighty says, you did a mitzvah, you will get reward. And not only will I give you reward, I will let you choose which part of your existence is primary and which part of your existence do you want to have the reward paid out to you. Not only will the Almighty reward good deeds, the Almighty gives you the choice. Which world do you want to be paid in? What currency do you want to be paid in? Do you want it in this world, or do you want it in Olam Haba? A righteous is someone who implicitly says, I favor my soul over my body. I favor my spiritual half over my physical half. That's the definition of a righteous person. And therefore, that person, the righteous person, is implicitly requesting from God, reward me in the afterlife. A wicked person, by definition, is someone who prioritizes the physical, the transient nature of a body, and therefore is making a request from God, please reward me here. And God's pro-choice. God says, okay, you want the reward in Olam Haba? I'll reserve it for Olam Haba. You want the reward here? I'll give it to you here. It's up to you. You make a choice which half of your existence you want to make primary and which half you want to be only incidental. It's super duper fair. Not only will the Almighty reward the wicked for every mitzvah they do, the Almighty will also let the wicked choose to be paid here. Which is, by the way, why it's very important, or it's very beneficial, to not choose to cash out early, because then you are going to be exhausting your reward for Olam Haba. If you say, God, pay me in pesos, God says, okay, is that what you want? I'll pay you in pesos. Or you could say, pay me in kilos of gold in the afterlife. And by the way, this is a tangent here. Abraham and Jacob, they're both terrified that they have exhausted all their reward over here. Chapter 15, chapter 15 of Genesis, that is, God has to reassure Abraham, don't worry, your reward is reserved for the afterlife. When Jacob is about to reunite with his brother Esau, he's worried that he has become small, he has been diminished by all the goodness that might did for him in this world. We see a pattern that the righteous are very wary of receiving any reward here because it may detract from their reward in the afterlife. But that's, again, an idea. This is a foundational idea of how they might dispense reward and punishment. Everything's accounted for, and a person gets to choose their primary identity and the area in which they want to receive reward. There's another point over here. We're told that there's a big mitzvah and then there's a small mitzvah. The righteous are rewarded for the small mitzvah in Olam Haba. The wicked is rewarded for the small mitzvah here. There is size relative to reward in mitzvos and in sin. So size exists and size matters, both in mitzvos and how much reward they engender, and in transgressions and how much punishment they beget. What determines the size, the robustness of a mitzvah that gets a big fat reward, and what determines the size and robustness of a sin? The answer is found in a very short Mishnah in the end of the 5th chapter of Pirkei Avos. Lifum tzara agra. To the degree of pain is the degree of reward. The more difficult it is for a person to do something, the greater their reward that they earn for that thing. Meaning this is completely individualized. For one person, doing a mitzvah, a given mitzvah, is relatively easy, and therefore the reward is relatively small. For a different person, the identical mitzvah may be very difficult, and therefore the reward that gets is much bigger. And there could be two different people doing the identical mitzvah. There could be also one person doing the identical mitzvah at a different time. When you're not in the mood, for example, you're not in the mood to do a mitzvah. Oh, it's a bad day, you're in a terrible mood. Yesterday you were on fire. Yesterday you were just firing on all cylinders. You were in a great mood. It was really easy for you to do the mitzvah. Today you're down, you're depressed, you're not in the mood, you're all cynical, and you do the mitzvah nonetheless. It was much harder for you to do it today, and therefore the reward for today's mitzvah is much greater. And by the way, this is orders of magnitude larger. Our sages tell us one mitzvah done in pain exceeds 100 mitzvahs done when it was easy. And that number might in fact be all the way up to 10,000, 100 times 100. You could have a person doing one mitzvah and it's super easy. They get 1 unit of credit, 1 unit of reward. If it's super duper hard, that identical mitzvah may yield 10,000 units of reward. And again, everything taken into account to determine how difficult it is, who the person is, what kind of mood they're in, what's the situation, what's their background, what are the circumstances and the situations of the particular opportunity to do a mitzvah. So I'll give you an example. For me, it's really easy to keep Shabbos. Totally easy. Why? I've done it my whole life. I always say I'm brainwashed. I've been brainwashed. I've been indoctrinated. I've been drinking the Kool-Aid intravenously my whole life. So to me, that this is so easy. Someone who's never kept Shabbos in their life, it's so difficult to do it because they're not used to it. They don't have the communal framework to make it possible, to make it easy to do. They're not used to it. They're not anticipating it. For them, it's really hard. I would imagine that the reward that someone like that gets for keeping one Shabbos exceeds the reward that I get for keeping 100 Shabboses, maybe even more. For me, it's easy. The reward's really small. For them, it's hard. And to the degree of difficulty is the degree of reward. And by the way, conversely, the opposite would in fact be true. For someone like me, I have the background, thank God. If I were, God forbid, to violate the Shabbos, of course, that would be a huge, unconscionable sin, but it would be way worse because it was so easy for you to do it, yet you did not maintain it. So for someone like me, to violate Shabbos would be way worse than for someone who doesn't have that same background. Now, again, anyone who violates the Shabbos, Torah says, it's part of the Ten Commandments. Torah says that it's very severe. But nevertheless, for someone who it's easier to do it, that corresponding sin, should someone, God forbid, violate the Shabbos, would be that much worse. So there's variability in the difficulty of doing a mitzvah, and conversely, in doing a sin, and therefore there is variability in the reward and the punishment. The Talmud tells us, we've spoken about this in the past, there was a rabbi who had a near-death experience. And when he came to, when he was resuscitated, they asked him, what do you see? And he said, I saw an upside-down world, a topsy-turvy world. The lofty ones are lowly, and the lowly ones are lofty. And they said to him, no, you didn't see an upside-down world. You saw a clear world. Our world is upside down. There is a fundamental difference between how our world accords honor and accords reward and punishment versus how God does it. We don't have the tools to properly judge people. We don't know what a person's background is. We don't know what their history is. We don't know what their challenges are. We don't know what their Yetzer Hara is. We can only look at the results. We can only judge in absolute terms. We're not able to see all the nuances that go into determining a person and their background and their kind of challenges. And therefore, if there's someone, let's say, who was granted all the gifts and they accomplished a lot, but they did only 50% of what they could have accomplished, they are not, in God's eyes, as lofty as someone who did a third, a tenth, a hundredth on an absolute scale of what they did, but someone who maximized their potential. If you do 100% of what you can do, even if in absolute terms that's 100th of what someone else does, you are completely righteous. Because God judges everyone as an individual relative to their unique circumstance. No one is expected to do more than they can in fact do, and no one is let off the hook for what they could have done. So effort matters, and therefore the degree of difficulty, that's going to determine the value of a mitzvah. How much did it hurt you to do it? How much effort and devotion and dedication did you expend? And therefore, listen to this. What about when someone tries to do a mitzvah? They try really, really hard to do a mitzvah, but something external torpedoes it. You tried to do it, but it failed. And was not at all due to your behavior, your choices. Says the Talmud, the book of Kiddushin, page 40a, in the middle. Amar Rav Asi, afilu chashav adam lasos mitzvah. A person tried to do mitzvah. They intended to do it, but something came up, something happened, an accident happened. The Almighty considered it as if they actually fulfilled it. They get the reward as if they did it. But vice versa, it doesn't work like that. You try to do a sin, but you didn't actually do it because of something else, you are spared the punishment. If you try to do a mitzvah, you invested the effort to do it, that will grant you reward. And by the way, this is an amazing difference in the reward that God distributes versus how we do it. Here, you are rewarded for what you actually accomplished. So suppose you work really hard, but for whatever reason it fails, you're out of luck. You try to study your mathematics or your science and you write half your dissertation, and for whatever reason you can't finish it, you get 0 credit in this world. No one cares how much you actually tried. In Torah, the effort is rewarded. And therefore, someone can have enormous accomplishments, but they can be rewarded less than someone who has meager accomplishments, but had to work harder to achieve them. It's a true meritocracy of effort and degree of difficulty, not outcome. There's another idea here. God is fair. God is precise in judgment. Now, if you look at this verse that we quoted in Deuteronomy, God is righteous. God is fair in judgment. It seems like it's pretty muted praise. Oh, God's fair? Don't we have human judges that are fair too? Why is this praise that's worthy for God? So the commentaries tell us that in our world, we cannot do true justice. Why is that? Because there are consequences and consequences of consequences. There's the butterfly effect that you have no idea what are the ultimate consequences of your choices. And therefore, you're punishing someone. Let's say you punish someone. You imprison them. They did a crime. You imprison them. You're not just punishing them. You're punishing their colleagues, their family, their neighbors. Who knows how many people you're actually punishing? People who are completely innocent of any crime. But our judicial system cannot take that into account because we're not God. But God is fair in judgment. There is no iniquity in God's system of reward and punishment. And therefore, God will only punish someone if they are, in fact, guilty or they are deserving of that degree of punishment. And therefore, God won't punish daddy if daddy's kids are undeserving or unworthy in any way of having that done to them. So here's a controversial idea. The Chazon Ish, he said that it's a bad idea to get life insurance. Now, just for the sake of full disclosure, I actually have life insurance. But listen to this idea. He says, you're put on the scale. Should this person live or should they die? So again, if it's a human court, they could only take into account the alleged offenses of the person being judged, of the defendant. But God takes everything into account. And therefore, if your kids are going to suffer because you're not around, you may be guilty, but the kids are innocent. And therefore, it's not fair to judge them, to punish them for your crimes. But what's going to be when daddy has a big fat insurance policy? Daddy is gone, but you know what? The kids are still fine. They're tended to. Well, now you have removed, so to speak, one factor that's arguing for your exoneration, and that may in fact lead you to be more likely to expire. And therefore, says Chazon Ish, shouldn't get life insurance. Again, I'm not declaring this as a rule. As I mentioned, I do have life insurance, but at least the principle is true. If the Almighty works with such complete precision, it's completely righteous, and there's absolutely no iniquity, this actually makes a lot of sense. But again, the general idea is that the way the Almighty does it is completely different than what we're even capable of doing it. It's completely honest, completely fair, completely just, and completely righteous. That's another element of divine reward and punishment. Here's another idea. The Almighty is going to have a bias towards reward over punishment. Now listen to this idea. We know that the Almighty created the world because he wanted to do good. He wanted to be a benefactor to humans, because humans could be recipients of God's goodness. The Almighty's ultimate desire, is to do good. If so, why does he punish? Isn't punishment doing bad? Punishing people? So sages tell us that punishment is actually for the benefit of the individual being punished. The man isn't punished like we would to get revenge, to get back at someone. No. The Almighty punishes like a loving father disciplines a misbehaving child. The Almighty reprimands and admonishes out of love. to help cleanse them from their flaws, to help prime them for reward. As a result, there's a fundamental difference between reward and punishment. Reward, that's the Almighty's actual desire. That's what he wants to do. That's why he created the world. Punishment, well, that's only to facilitate reward. And therefore, it's going to be a bias favoring reward over punishment. He loves his creations like a father loves their children. And therefore, reward is things working as intended, and punishment is not quite equal. It's not the desired outcome. It's like a father's reprimandation, and therefore it's going to be less. It's going to be weaker than the parallel punishment. Sorry, than the parallel reward. So here's an example of this. We already mentioned this earlier. One example is when a person tries to do a mitzvah, but for whatever reason, they weren't able to do it. They weren't able to consummate that mitzvah. They receive the reward. But the Bible will only punish someone if they, in fact, succeeded in actualizing their transgression. Similarly, we find the following idea. In the Talmud, the Almighty's reward outshines punishment by a factor of 500. The verse says the Almighty will extract punishment for 4 generations, but will extend reward for 2,000 generations. Thus, by a factor of 500, the Almighty favors reward over punishment. And here's where it gets interesting. We don't have a concept of the amount of reward that God gives. What's the rate of reward for a mitzvah? How much is the reward for a given mitzvah? Torah doesn't reveal to us the extent of the reward that God accords those who listen to him. In fact, we're told in the Mishnah, first Mishnah in chapter 2 of Pirkei Avos, Ein ata yodeh matan schar shel mitzvah. You don't know the reward of a mitzvah. Nevertheless, we get some clues. And what we discover is that if we have this little window, this little appreciation of how the Almighty gives reward, what we discover is that the reward is staggering relative to a mitzvah. So listen to this. In the book of Numbers, Bamidbar, the end of Parshas Baha'aloscha, Miriam, who is Moshe's older sister, she speaks Lashon Hara against Moshe. And she gets saras, she becomes a leper. And she has to have 7 days of quarantine until she can be healed from her malady. And the verse tells us that the nation did not travel. It was time for the nation to travel. They didn't travel, and they waited for her for 7 days. Why did they wait 7 days for Miriam? This one old lady. There's a nation of millions of people. Why is everyone waiting for Miriam? So Rashi tells us, quoting from the Talmud in the book of Sota, Rashi tells us because she once waited for someone else. When Moshe, her younger brother, was a baby, the mom, Yocheved, had to improvise and place Moshe in a box in the Nile because there was a decree mandating that all babies be chucked into the water. And his sister Miriam was waiting and observing and watching to see what's going to be with Moshe. And as a reward for her waiting for Moshe, the nation waited for her. I always say that this example gives us a snapshot of the divine system of reward. How long did she wait for him? So the Talmud says that she waited 1 hour for Moshe until Pharaoh's daughter came and eventually adopted Moshe. So you have 1 hour that she waited for one person waited for one person, and then you have 7 days that a nation of millions waited for her. Moreover, she waited for her brother. Who wouldn't wait for their sibling? Find out what's going to be with him. A whole nation waited for a stranger. And I always say that, this is, even if we were strangers, you see a mom placing a baby in a box and letting it flow on a river. I feel like I would be curious to see what's going to be the destiny of that baby. I'd watch out of sheer curiosity. That's not quite the same as waiting for the DMV, right? Nevertheless, we see, how does the Almighty evaluate? She waited for 1 hour. A nation of millions is going to wait for 7 days. That's like thousands of times, millions of times, billions of times more than what she waited. Think about it. If you have a nation of 3 million and she waited for 1 hour, how many hours are there in a day? How many hours are there in 7 days? And you multiply that times how many people? We're talking about millions and billions of times more than what she did. She got out of it. A little window in how the amplification of mitzvos results in the reward for said mitzvos. Here's another example. Listen to this. One of the worst villains of our history was a man named Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. He was the one who destroyed the first temple, slaughtered countless Jews, took countless Jews as slaves in chains to Babylon. And he was effectively the king of the entire world. His sprawling empire essentially covered all of the known world, or the civilized world at the time. Civilized is a relative term. He was the most powerful man the world had ever seen. How did he get that honor? The Talmud asked that question. How did Nebuchadnezzar, how did he get that honor? Says the Talmud, it was in the merit of the 4 steps that he took. What are these 4 steps? It says the Talmud, this is the book of Sanhedrin, page 96a. He was a secretary who worked for the previous king of Babylon, Merodach Baladan, and this other king of Babylon wanted to write a letter to Chizkiah, the king of the Jews, who was sick. The Talmud tells us, how did he know who Chizkiah was, or that he was sick? It tells us, just some interesting backstory here, that Chizkiah was a righteous king, but his father was a wicked king, Achaz. And when Achaz died, there was a miracle that the day was shortened. Why? Because he was such a wicked king, and therefore it was inappropriate to mourn him as you would mourn an ordinary king. And therefore, the Almighty shrunk the day in order that there shouldn't be enough time, or there should be so much time to mourn this wicked king. And when the king of Babylon says, well, what happened today? Why is today such a short day? They said, well, Achaz died. And then when Chizkiah was sick, King Chizkiah, Hezekiah, when he was sick, those extra hours that were removed from the day of the funeral of his father were added to the day so that there's more daylight, so that way his healing happens in a more expedited fashion. And therefore the king of Babylon says, wait, what's happening now? Why is the day so much longer? They'd say to him, well, King Chizkiah is ill. And he says, oh, he's ill. I got to send him a letter wishing him a recovery. So who was writing that letter? Nebuchadnezzar was the scribe. And they were writing the letter, and the letter said, greetings to King Chizkiah, greetings to the city of Jerusalem, and greetings to the great Almighty God. So it said first greetings to Chizkiah, and only subsequently did it say greetings to the great Almighty God. So Nebuchadnezzar, he says, wait a minute, something inappropriate over here. First, you should praise God, and only subsequently should you praise the king Chizkiah. So he ran out after the messengers and says, no, we got to switch it. We got to alter it. We got to alter the text of the blessing. First, you have to say greetings to God, and then you say greetings to King Chistia. So indeed, Nebuchadnezzar pursued the messenger, and they revised the letter. Says the Talmud, why did he become such a powerful king? And why did he become the king of Babylon, the king of the whole world? Because he ran 4 paces to uphold the honor of God. Says the Talmud, had he ran even further, he would have completely destroyed the Jewish people. He would have had so much power as a reward for his upstanding of the honor of God, or for standing up for the honor of God, that the Jewish people would have been completely destroyed. His power would not have been curtailed at all. Says the Talmud, imagine the reward of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Nebuchadnezzar was rewarded in this world because he ran 4 paces for the honor of God. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they ran their whole lives like tireless horses to uphold and to stand up for the honor of God. Imagine their reward. Says Rashi, you will be astonished at the reward. If this is what an evil person, King Nebuchadnezzar, gets for 4 paces, that's it, 4 steps that he took for the honor of God, he was given so much reward in this world. Imagine the reward for Abram, Isaac, and Jacob. I think this is a valuable idea. The reward is not equal to the effort expended. It's amplified by factors of millions. None of us would say that the deserving reward for 4 paces, when someone walks 4 paces for God's honor, that should result in the honor and distinction and stature of Nebuchadnezzar. We wouldn't say that, but that's how God works. And we have no idea the reward that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are getting or are destined to get in the afterlife. We have no idea. Our eye cannot see that. But this gives us just a picture of the rate of reward that the Almighty dispenses. In God's eyes, the deserving reward for walking 4 steps for God is the equivalent of becoming someone as powerful as Nebuchadnezzar. He's not going to get any reward in the afterlife, and therefore it's all given to him here. And this makes sense. And this idea, I think, explains why. And this idea explains why our sages always remind us to keep in the back of our minds the concept of reward and punishment, so that way we don't sin in this world. Look at 3 things, visualize 3 things, and you will not sin, says the Mishnah in the beginning of the 2nd chapter of Pirkei Avos. Know what's above you, a seeing eye, a listening ear, and all your deeds are inscribed in a book. The first Mishnah of the 3rd chapter of Pirkei Avos tells us, look at 3 things and you won't sin. Know before whom you are destined to give an accounting and a reckoning before God. So again, this idea of reward and punishment is very helpful for us to help us construct our life and the priorities that we have and the choices that we make and the agenda that we set for ourselves in this world, because we know that there is boundless reward that's designated for those who adhere to God. And of course, the flip side, the punishment for violation of the will of God is equally draconian and intense. And again, I want to point out, this is still an introduction to the subject of reward and punishment. We're trying to get more of an understanding into the nature of the divine method of reward and punishment. And we learned that God is completely fair. Nothing is overlooked. Nothing is immaterial. Nothing's insignificant. The ultimate reward and punishment is an Olam Haba. The tzaddik ends up with ultimate reward. The wicked one ends up with ultimate punishment, and incidentals are addressed over here. Not all mitzvahs are created equal, and the thing that determines the degree of reward is how difficult it was for a person to do that, and everything is individualized. You get rewarded for your effort. How hard was it? How much did you have to expend? Even if that does not necessarily translate to results. And then we learned about a bias towards reward over punishment. That is what the Almighty is in fact desirous of. There's a factor of 500 more reward over punishment. And we saw a few examples of the staggering rate of reward relative to a person's input. And it's good advice to remember that we will face judgment that will help us make sure that we live a righteous life and an exceptional life. Of course, there's still so much to cover. We're going to talk about the Gehenna. I'm really excited for that. I read some crazy stuff recently. I'm excited to share that. All about what's all about. What do we know about it? What is beyond us? What happens after you die? Reincarnation. I'm really excited about all these subjects coming up in our Torah 101 series. Until then, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. And I'm ready. Let's go. Hit me.
I have something I thought of, which was the rule for Jewish men that they can't walk 4 cubits without their head covered with a kippah. And so when you said keep it in the back of your head, it was just hilarious for me.
Oh, great. I like that. I try to keep it interesting. I like making jokes.
I have something.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, and I have to quote your grandfather, Kumash. Kumash. He had in there in Exodus, okay, Nosei Baal.
Yes.
Okay, where you feel the pain of somebody else. Is
Yes.
that part of what you're talking about as far as?
Of course.
Yeah, that was remarkable because sometimes go ahead.
Yeah, that's the quality of a great leader is someone who cares about other people and helps bear the burden. You know, that's the praise given to Moshe, right? So there's no greater praise than that. And again, that's an example of someone doing a mitzvah. That is a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah of emulation of God. When someone emulates God, someone mimics God, that is a mitzvah that yields tremendous reward. Absolutely.
He also mentioned about hearing with your ear and hearing with your heart, and he related that to Jethro. And when he heard,
Yes.
and then he didn't just hear it, he came and came to the Israelites to find out what happened. Yeah.
Yeah, there's it's one thing to hear about something, and there's a whole different level of knowledge that spurs behavior.
And I think that's also what happens when we read something, which I've read this before, and it didn't impact me as much as it did now because I think I just heard it with my ear.
Yes. Very important.
Okay.
Yes.
A quick question.
Yes.
So say when you do a mitzvah and you take somebody, say, to a doctor's appointment, and
Yes.
it's a kind thing to do, but then they want to repay you by buying your lunch. Should you refuse the lunch?
No, you could accept that. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact,
Does that
it might-
not take away
it
from
might-
the reward?
no, I'll tell you why not.
Okay.
It might actually be preferable because we like to, it's a nice thing where you say, oh, that guy owes me one. They owe me one, right? Because I did them a favor. So now they owe me a favor. So sometimes it's better to kind of exhaust that merit and to remove the bad feelings of the need for reciprocity. And it might actually be beneficial that you say, okay, you know what, you pay me back. We're equal now, right? And that way they don't feel like they owe you now forever.
But that's a mitzvah for them too.
Of course, appreciation. It's a critical thing. You have to appreciate. It's one of the most important qualities that we're trying to adopt.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, who's next?
So this might seem like an obvious question, but what's the fundamental difference between a righteous and a wicked person?
Okay, great question. There's probably a few different ways to define that. The way I like to define it is a question of priorities. What do they prioritize? They prioritize the soul or the body? And that, of course, that means mitzvah versus sin. It means this world versus the next world. It means God versus Yetzer Hara. There's a lot of different ways to say the same idea. The question is, what are they living for? What's the objective of their life? It's a great question.
Thank you.
Sure. It's so great to see everyone here. Is this like the best thing to do on a Sunday morning?
Mhm.
The best, right? I love it.
Nothing like it at all.
It's great. And you know what? I was telling someone recently, even though it's nice to get together in person, and I still want to figure out how to do that on maybe on a quarterly schedule or something like that. But it's really nice to be able to drive just the Torch Center. It's like a 5-minute drive versus driving. We used to do that for years and years. Drove all the way to Temple Bet Torah or Nativ, like a 45-minute drive. It's a lot easier to just drive here.
It's even easier just to go into your office here, my house.
That's true. So it's easier all around.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, but I still hope that we eventually will be able to get out of this pandemic, and every once in a while, get together in person. There are a bunch of members of the group who joined, of course, now that it's on Zoom, but there's also members of the group that kind of dropped out because they do Zoom the whole week. So I'd love to get everyone back in as much as we can, but of course we have to wait until the pandemic is really over. So I feel like we're near the end. You guys heard my prediction about this, but I've been wrong before. So what do I always say? I stopped betting after the 2016 election.
There you go.
I stopped betting.
Rabbi, one more comment?
Yes. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Rewards and punishments. We talked about that before, and there's a disconnect. I mean, when I was little, my mom told me not to touch something, and I got immediate response.
Yes.
And therefore, I never touched it again.
Yes.
However, with God, he delays.
And that's why we have free will, right? If everything was instantaneous, you wouldn't have free will. I'll give you an example. This past week we read about the splitting of the sea. I always say, if I split the bayou, then there will be no free will. I say, listen, I'm a prophet of God. I'm going to split the bayou. Who wants to believe me? And boom, I take my staff, split the bayou, right? That's it. There's no free will, right? So what happened when the Jewish people lost his parsha? Moshe split the sea for them. And what happened right away afterwards? The very next thing that happens. Who remembers? Nancy. Looks like Nancy remembers. You remember, Nancy?
Is it the golden calf?
Nope. Good guess, but nope. It's a very good guess. In the same verse that they left. Okay, you want to say? I don't. You're on mute.
They followed him. I mean, they trusted him, right?
So the very next thing that happened after the splitting of the sea is Moshe. Well, of course, they sing after they finished singing, and after Miriam finishes singing, they travel in the wilderness for 3 days with no water, and then they arrive to Mara. And the Mara has water, but the waters are bitter. So my grandfather used to always say, he says, that's what happens when you have a revelation, the kind of the lights of the splitting of the sea. The Almighty makes a test that is so devastating that makes it really balanced. If I split the bayou, but that means you have 3 days with no water, right? It's not as impressive anymore, right? The test always has to be commensurate to the level of revelation in order to preserve the free will.
Gotcha. Yeah, good.
Okay, Paul, we're ready.
All right, so a little off the main topic, but a question about one of the examples you used.
Yes.
So we just covered the whole episode of Yocheved putting Moses in the basket And it just struck me, is there commentary or discussions in the Talmud that what did they know? I mean, that seems, the way it's, you read it plainly is seems so unlikely that it could happen randomly. In other words, they must have known that maybe they knew, or they had some insight that this could happen, and they set it up. Because I mean, how long would she have waited? 8 hours overnight if that didn't happen? I mean, what was the plan?
So you're
This
asking about you're asking about a counterfactual. I'll tell you what we do know. We do know is the Talmud says this, that Miriam, she had a prophetic vision that Moshe was going to be the leader who's going to save the Jewish people. The Talmud says that. That's why she's called Miriam. Rashi even reads down last parsha that Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron. So Rashi's a question. What do you mean sister of Aaron? She's a sister of Aaron and of Moshe. Says Rashi, she was a prophetess when she was just a sister of Aaron, i.e., before Moshe was born. Her prophecy was that she prophesied that Moshe is going to be born and he's going to save the Jewish people. So it seems like Miriam had some sort of premonition of how special Moshe is, and therefore maybe she would have waited as long as it took. And maybe that's why, the reward is so outsized, because maybe her commitment would have been to stay there as long as, say, for 7 days, whatever it took. So that might be help resolve your question. But again, we don't know how long she was committed, because again, within an hour, we're told, the princess came and found Moshe and adopted Moshe, and ironically raised Moshe in the household of Pharaoh. It's always the great irony of the whole story is that Pharaoh is doing everything he can to avoid the Jewish people having a savior, and ultimately he was the one who raised the savior in his own palace. It's this straight twist of irony. Okay, who's next?
I'll go, Rabbi. So when you're talking about reward and punishment, and who, does it depend on your level of belief? Is that kind of how I don't know how to say this, but so if someone does something good, but they don't really believe that in God or in Hashem, then are they more rewarded in this world because of their belief? But if they don't know, how are they punished? Even if they don't know because they're not exposed. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So again, this goes into the godly calculation. We can't do these kinds of calculations. We don't know who's righteous, who's wicked. We don't make those judgments, because only God knows.
Right. Okay. Fair.
And it's possible that there's a criminal who's literally a criminal, but is really righteous in God's eyes, because you know what? They had their upbringing was such that there's no way for them to not be a criminal. But they were only a small criminal, only misdemeanors and no felonies.
Right.
Wow, what an amazing person. And then you have a tzaddik, a righteous person, but they should have been much better. There's no way for us to make that calculation. Right. And again, today we live in a world where a lot of Jews are not exposed at all to Torah. They they don't know anything about it. And again, the Talmud has a term for that. Talmud talks about the tinoch nishba, a baby that was taken hostage, right? Kidnapped. How could you blame the baby for not knowing that they're Jewish, not knowing what that means?
Right.
So we're very, very wary against trying to point fingers or point blame or assign guilt. We don't know. We leave that to God. But again, we're trying to understand how God works, and we do have a little bit of an inkling based upon what our sages tell us and based on what the Torah tells us about how the Almighty indeed operates. I see something else in the chat here. When or for who does it stop being helpful to ponder reward and punishment? When or for who? I hope we're trying to cover the subject as comprehensively as possible. If it's part of the Torah, if it's part of the sources, we're not speculating, and we're not. There is a kind of teacher that likes to really make focus primarily on reward and punishment. Talk about how the misery of hell and all that and punishment. And, if that's the only thing you got, if that's the only thing we did, I would say, you know what, maybe sprinkle in some positivity as well. But I think that because, this is the next subject in our series, it's important for us to do it properly. If it's not going to be productive, some people are very, very depressed. Maybe that would be a case where they should say, you know what, skip this one. Maybe that, listen, if it's not going to be helpful, if it's going to send someone to depression, it's probably the right thing for them to study. So I think that would be a good case. For us, we're going to try to do it as rigorously as we do everything else. This is what's next on our list, and we're going to try to cover it fundamentally. So I hope that answers your question, Jacob. As always, wonderful class. Oh, thank you. Chag Sameach, Tu B'Shvat, and Shavua Tov. Shalom, everyone. Okay. Anything else before we sign off here? Okay. Please God, next week, same time?
Yes.
Same time, and tonight at
Thank
4
you.
p.m. So we'll see you guys.
For the first, maybe the first or second time I remember the code for the Zoom without looking at my emails.
There you go. It's short and sweet now.
Yeah, it's only taken 2 years. So
yes.
Okay,
hey, I would have known if I would have been advised by some professionals.
No, I go to the actual.
You actually go to the code?
I put in the code, yeah.
Oh my goodness!
Because I have this system, this what's called.
That's right.
Yeah. So I just put in the code.
Okay.
Take care, everyone. See you next week.
Shalom, shalom.
Take care.
Thank you.